The shattering calm. The evening was serene, bathed in hues of amber, and rose as the sun began its slow descent behind a line of rooftops. Elijah Carter, a lanky, bright-eyed 17-year-old, pedaled through the quiet streets of Briarwood, his childhood neighborhood. This was his escape, a momentary retreat from the pressures of school, social expectations, and the vague but persistent weight of being a young black man in a world that often felt like it was holding its breath around him. Elijah loved his bike. It wasn't anything flashy, just a sturdy, second-hand mountain bike he and his dad had spent hours repairing together. The handlebars bore faded grips, and the chain rattled occasionally, but to Elijah, it was perfect. It symbolized freedom, a chance to explore, to dream, and to leave the noise of the world behind. As he weaved through the streets, the tires hummed against the pavement, a soothing sound that mixed seamlessly with the beat of the music pouring through his headphones. Each turn he took was a memory. This corner was where he'd first learned to ride without training wheels. That stretch of sidewalk was where he'd raced his friends until the streetlights came on. Briarwood wasn't just where he lived. It was part of him. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional car passing by or a neighbor watering their garden. Elijah waved at Mrs. Green, an elderly woman who sat on her porch every evening, knitting something colorful and impossible to identify until it was finished. She waved back with a warm smile, her silver curls catching the fading sunlight. Turning onto Maple Avenue, Elijah felt the wind pick up, tugging at his t-shirt and making the world feel alive. He took a deep breath, savoring the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming jasmine. For a moment, the world felt as it should, safe, familiar, and full of promise. But then it happened. The screech of brakes pierced the tranquil evening like a jagged shard of glass. It was sharp, deliberate, and far too close. Elijah's heart jolted, the sound sending a ripple of unease through him. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see a reckless driver, or perhaps someone avoiding a stray animal. Instead, he saw a police cruiser. The black and white patrol car sat idling a few meters behind him, its presence as imposing as the shadow it cast on the asphalt. The door opened, and out stepped a large white officer, his expression unreadable but his movements deliberate. The officer adjusted his belt, the weight of the equipment hanging from it, making a heavy thud that Elijah could hear even over the faint beat of his music. Elijah slowed his bike to a stop, his fingers tightening on the handlebars. His pulse quickened, a subtle but undeniable sense of dread creeping up his spine. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't riding on the wrong side of the street, and he wasn't causing trouble. He was just a kid on a bike in his own neighborhood. The officer's steps were slow and measured as he approached, his boots clicking against the pavement. His hand rested casually on the holster of his gun, the gesture more unsettling than it was reassuring. "Hey, kid," the officer called out, his voice carrying an edge that made Elijah's stomach tighten. "Stop right there." Elijah pulled his headphones down, letting them hang around his neck. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice steady but cautious. "What are you doing out here?" the officer asked, his tone laced with suspicion. "Just riding my bike," Elijah replied, forcing a polite smile. "I live a few blocks away." The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning Elijah from head to toe. It wasn't a glance. It was a judgment, a silent appraisal that left Elijah feeling exposed and small. "Got any ID on you?" Elijah's brow furrowed. "ID? No, sir, I'm just riding my bike." The officer took a step closer, and Elijah's grip on the handlebars tightened. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," he said, his hand still resting on his holster. "Stay where you are." Elijah's heart sank. He wanted to protest, to tell the officer he couldn't possibly be the person he was looking for, but he knew better. His father, a respected judge, had taught him how to handle situations like this, how to stay calm, how to be respectful, how to survive. "Sir, I'm not," Elijah started, but the officer interrupted him. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his voice rising. Elijah's stomach churned as he raised his hands, letting them hover just above the handlebars. His mind raced, each second stretching into an eternity. The neighborhood, once a sanctuary, now felt hostile and alien. The streets he knew so well seemed to close in around him, the familiar corners and cracks in the pavement suddenly insignificant. "Step off the bike," the officer ordered. Elijah hesitated, his eyes darting around for anyone who might witness what was happening. Mrs. Green's porch was empty, her chair rocking slightly in the breeze. The street was silent. "Now," the officer shouted, his hand moving to unclip his holster. Elijah swallowed hard and obeyed, carefully stepping off his bike and holding his hands up higher. The officer's eyes stayed locked on him, his posture tense. "Turn around," the officer commanded. Elijah complied, his mind racing with questions and fears. Why was this happening? What description could he possibly match? How could a simple bike ride turn into something so terrifying? The officer pulled his radio from his shoulder and began speaking into it, his words low and quick. Elijah couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone sent a chill through him. He glanced over his shoulder, only to be met with a sharp, "Don't move." The moment hung heavy in the air, each second dragging on like a lifetime. Elijah felt the weight of the officer's gaze, the judgment, the suspicion. He felt the weight of history, of stories he'd heard and warnings he'd been given. And most of all, he felt the weight of being powerless in a situation that seemed to spiral further out of control with each passing moment. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car engine revved and then faded into the night. The world kept moving, indifferent to the scene playing out on Maple Avenue. And then, as if the tension weren't already unbearable, the officer's hand went to his gun. He didn't draw it, but the gesture was enough to make Elijah's breath catch in his throat. "Stay right there," the officer said, his voice low and firm. "Backup's on the way." Back up, Elijah thought, panic creeping into his chest. "For what? I haven't done anything." The sun continued its descent, the golden light giving way to the shadows of dusk. And in those shadows, Elijah stood, a young black man on a quiet street, facing a moment he would never forget. A father's resolve. The tension in the air was suffocating. Elijah stood frozen, his hands trembling slightly as he held them in the air. The officer's hand remained on his holster, a constant, unspoken threat that gnawed at Elijah's composure. He felt trapped, as if every breath he took had to be calculated, careful, deliberate. A few streets away, Elijah's father, Judge Marcus Carter, was just finishing up his evening routine. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that came when both his wife and daughter were away for the weekend visiting family. Marcus had planned to use the quiet to catch up on reading and maybe indulge in a rare moment of solitude. But something about the silence didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the absence of Elijah. His son was rarely late, and though Marcus trusted him, the world outside their door was a place he taught Elijah to navigate with caution. Too many times, Marcus had sat on the bench and heard cases that reminded him just how easily a young black man's life could change in an instant. He glanced at the clock. Elijah should have been home by now. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed his son's number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. A pang of worry settled in his chest. He sent a quick text. "Hey, everything okay? Let me know where you are." Moments later, his phone buzzed with a call, not from Elijah, but from a neighbor. "Judge Carter," came the hesitant voice of Mrs. Green, her tone urgent. "I think you should know something's happening on Maple Avenue. I saw Elijah out on his bike earlier, and now there's a police car." Marcus's heart dropped. "What do you mean, a police car?" he asked, his voice tightening. "I didn't see everything," Mrs. Green admitted, "but it didn't look right. The officer was out of the car, and Elijah looked scared." Marcus didn't wait to hear more. He grabbed his keys, his coat, and his wallet, then headed out the door, his mind racing. His legal training kicked in, But so did his instincts as a father. He knew the law. He'd spent years upholding it, interpreting it, and ensuring justice was served. But in moments like these, the law felt fragile, like a shield that might not protect his son the way it should. The drive to Maple Avenue felt longer than it should have. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, his jaw clenched. The stories he'd heard from friends, colleagues, and clients played on repeat in his mind. Moments of injustice, of profiling, of outcomes that were as tragic as they were preventable. When he turned onto the street, his worst fears were realized. The scene before him was both surreal and infuriating. Elijah stood beside his bike, hands raised, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. The officer was towering over him, barking orders, while another patrol car pulled up, lights flashing. Marcus parked his car with a sharp jerk of the wheel and stepped out, his presence commanding despite the turmoil he felt inside. As he approached, his voice rang out, steady and firm. "Officer, what's going on here?" The officer glanced up, his expression shifting as he registered Marcus's tailored suit and authoritative tone. "Sir, I need you to step back," the officer said, holding up a hand. "I'm Judge Marcus Carter," Marcus said, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "That's my son you're detaining. I'd like to know why." The officer hesitated, the name clearly registering, but he didn't back down. "We're investigating a report of suspicious activity. Your son matches the description of a suspect." Marcus took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "What description? What crime? And why is your hand on your weapon? He's a child on a bicycle." "Sir, I need you to let us handle this," the officer said, his tone growing defensive. "You're not handling it," Marcus shot back. "You're escalating it. My son is no threat to you. He's unarmed, compliant, and doing nothing illegal." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus raised a hand to silence him. "And if you're so sure he matches a description, then I'm sure you won't mind me asking for a formal report of this incident. Badge number, name, and the reason for this stop." Now, by this point, neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Phones were out, cameras rolling. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted his weight, glancing at his backup for support. The second officer, a younger man who had just arrived, approached cautiously. "Judge Carter," he said, recognizing the name immediately. "Let's de-escalate this. Maybe we can talk this through." "No," Marcus said sharply. "De-escalation starts with you removing your colleague's hand from his holster and letting my son lower his hands." The younger officer turned to his partner, murmuring something under his breath. The first officer reluctantly stepped back, his hand falling away from his weapon. "Fine," he muttered, "but I still need to see some ID." Elijah, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice shaking. "I told you, I don't have ID on me. I was just riding my bike." Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, grounding him. "You don't need to carry ID to ride a bike, Elijah," he said softly, before turning back to the officers. "Unless you have probable cause to arrest him, I suggest you let him go." The officers exchanged glances, the tension between them palpable. Finally, the younger one nodded. "We'll file a report and move on," he said. "Apologies for the misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," Marcus repeated, his voice heavy with controlled anger. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was profiling. I'll be following up on this." The officers retreated to their cars, and the crowd slowly began to disperse. Marcus turned to Elijah, his expression softening. "Are you okay, son?" Elijah nodded, though his eyes were glassy. "Yeah. I didn't know what to do." Marcus pulled him into a tight hug. "You did everything right, and I'll make sure they answer for this." As they walked back to the car, Marcus's mind churned with thoughts of what he would do next. This wasn't just about Elijah. It was about ensuring that no other father, no other son, would have to face a moment like this. This was the beginning of a battle Marcus was ready to fight, not just as a judge, but as a father, a protector, and an advocate for justice. Ripples of injustice. The following morning, the Carter household was a mix of silence and tension. Marcus sat at the dining table, a cup of coffee in hand, staring at the notebook where he had scribbled down every detail of the previous night's encounter. Across from him, Elijah picked at his breakfast, his usual appetite replaced by a lingering unease. "Did you sleep at all?" Marcus asked, his voice soft but concerned. Elijah shrugged, not looking up from his plate. "A little, I guess." Marcus studied his son for a moment, noting the way his shoulders slumped and the dark circles under his eyes. Elijah had always been an optimistic kid, the kind who found joy in the simplest things. But now he looked worn down, as if a piece of his spark had been dimmed overnight. "Elijah," Marcus began, leaning forward, "I know last night was scary. I know it wasn't fair, but I need you to talk to me about how you're feeling." Elijah hesitated, then set down his fork. "I just keep thinking, what if you hadn't shown up? What if they didn't care who you were? I mean, I wasn't doing anything wrong, but they still treated me like I didn't belong. In my own neighborhood." Marcus's chest tightened. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those words, not from Elijah, but from clients, friends, and even strangers who had come to him seeking justice. But hearing it from his own son hit differently. It felt personal, visceral. "You do belong," Marcus said firmly. "And what happened last night doesn't change that. But it does mean we have work to do." Elijah frowned. "What kind of work?" "The kind that makes sure this doesn't happen again," Marcus replied. "To you or anyone else." Later that day, Marcus sat in his home office, phone pressed to his ear as he made call after call. His first call was to the Briarwood Police Department. He asked for the chief and was met with the expected round of redirections and hold music. When he finally got through, Chief Harold Bryant's voice greeted him, cautious but professional. "Judge Carter, I've been made aware of the incident with your son. Let me assure you, we're taking this matter seriously." "I'm glad to hear that," Marcus replied, his tone measured. "But words aren't enough. I want the body cam footage from both officers involved. I also want to see the report they filed and the alleged description they were acting on." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand your concerns," Bryant said finally. "But as you know, there are protocols for releasing that kind of information." "I'm well aware of the protocols, Chief," Marcus said, his voice firm. "And I'm prepared to use every legal avenue available to ensure transparency. This isn't just about my son. This is about accountability." The chief sighed. "I'll see what I can do." "Do more than see," Marcus said before ending the call. He didn't stop there. Marcus reached out to colleagues in the legal community, civil rights advocates, and even local media contacts. He knew that change didn't come from silence. It came from shining a light on injustice, no matter how uncomfortable it made people. By evening, the story was gaining traction. A local news station had picked up the incident, framing it as a broader issue of racial profiling in suburban neighborhoods. Social media posts about Elijah's experience began to circulate, shared by neighbors, friends, and community leaders. Marcus knew the power of public pressure, but he also knew it wasn't enough on its own. This fight would require more than headlines. It would require systemic change. Meanwhile, Elijah found himself caught in the whirlwind of attention. Friends texted him to check in, their messages a mix of support and disbelief. Some of his classmates posted messages online, condemning the officer's actions. Others stayed silent, their absence more telling than any words they could have offered. By the third call from a concerned friend, Elijah turned off his phone. The attention felt overwhelming, like a spotlight he hadn't asked for. "Hey," said a familiar voice from the doorway. Elijah looked up to see his father, holding 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. "Thought you might need this," Marcus said, handing him one of the mugs before sitting beside him on the couch. Elijah took a sip, letting the warmth spread through him. "Thanks. You holding up okay?" Marcus asked. I guess, Elijah replied. It's just weird. All these people are talking about what happened, but none of it changes how I felt last night. How scared I was. Marcus nodded. I get that. And you're right. It doesn't change what happened, but it does mean people are paying attention. That's the first step. Yeah, but what if it doesn't matter? Elijah asked, his voice heavy with doubt. What if they just keep doing it? To me, to other kids. Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Then we don't stop fighting. We hold them accountable every single time. Because that's how change happens, slowly, painfully, but surely. Elijah didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared into his mug, the swirls of whipped cream and cocoa mirroring the thoughts swirling in his mind. Finally, he said, I want to help. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Help how? I don't know yet, Elijah admitted, but I don't want to just sit here and do nothing. If we're going to fight this, I want to be part of it. A small smile broke across Marcus's face. That's my boy. The next day, father and son attended a community meeting at the local recreation center. Word of the incident had spread quickly, and the room was packed with neighbors, activists, and concerned citizens. Marcus had been invited to speak, but he hadn't come alone. He brought Elijah, knowing that his son's voice would carry a weight that even his own title couldn't. When it was their turn to speak, Marcus introduced himself briefly before stepping aside. Tonight, I want you to hear from someone who lived this experience firsthand. My son, Elijah. Elijah hesitated for a moment before stepping up to the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. He took a deep breath, his father's reassuring nod giving him the courage to speak. I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life, Elijah began. I know every street, every corner, every crack in the sidewalk. This is home. But last night, for the first time, I felt like I didn't belong. Like I was a stranger in my own home. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. What happened to me wasn't right. And it's not just about me. It's about all the kids who get stopped, questioned, or worse, just because of how we look. That's not the world I want to live in. And I don't think it's the world any of us want to live in. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a mix of solidarity and resolve. As Elijah stepped down, Marcus pulled him into a brief hug, pride evident in his expression. That night, as they walked home, Elijah felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just a victim of what had happened. He was part of the solution. And for the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope. Seeds of resistance. The days following Elijah's public speech at the community meeting brought an intensity neither he nor Marcus had fully anticipated. The story of Elijah's encounter with the police continued to ripple outward, capturing the attention of local and regional media. Calls flooded in from activists, legal organizations, and even other families who had experienced similar incidents. At the center of it all, Marcus worked tirelessly. His dual role as a judge and a father gave him a unique perspective and a platform. He knew he couldn't litigate this issue from the bench, but he could certainly use his influence to push for meaningful reform. In the morning light filtering through his office window, Marcus leaned back in his chair, reviewing the documents he'd requested from the police department. After days of persistence, he'd finally obtained the officers' reports and body cam footage. As he scrolled through the video, his jaw tightened. The footage showed Elijah riding down the street, earbuds in, entirely unaware of the patrol car creeping behind him. The officer's conversation was audible. "Looks like one of those kids from the call," said the older officer, Officer Simmons. "He's on a bike." "That's not in the description," the younger officer, Officer Davis, replied, his tone uncertain. "Still worth checking out," Simmons insisted, pulling the car over sharply. Marcus paused the video, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Still worth checking out. Those words alone epitomized the problem. Assumptions, biases, a readiness to act on suspicion instead of evidence. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. Emotion had its place, but right now, he needed strategy. The Carter Initiative. That afternoon, Marcus sat down with Elijah at the dining table. Spread out before them were charts, folders, and a yellow legal pad filled with notes. "What's all this?" Elijah asked, intrigued despite the heaviness of recent events. "This," Marcus said, gesturing to the papers, "is our plan. We're going to push for something I'm calling the Carter Initiative." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of plan?" Marcus tapped a finger on the legal pad. "It's threefold. First, mandatory bias training for all law enforcement officers in this jurisdiction. Second, a community oversight board that reviews incidents like what happened to you. And third, a policy change that requires officers to meet stricter standards of reasonable suspicion before initiating stops." Elijah looked at his father with a mixture of awe and skepticism. "That sounds huge. Can we really make that happen?" Marcus smiled. "Not alone. But with the community, with enough voices, and with the law on our side, we can make it happen." The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Marcus and Elijah worked together, reaching out to community leaders, organizing town hall meetings, and gathering signatures for their petition. Elijah, initially nervous about taking such a visible role, quickly found his stride. His peers, inspired by his courage, rallied around him, creating a youth-led subcommittee to support the initiative. One evening, after a particularly long day of organizing, Elijah sat on the porch steps with his best friend, Jamal. The two boys had been inseparable since kindergarten, but the events of the past week had added a new layer to their bond. "You're like famous now," Jamal teased, nudging Elijah. Elijah chuckled. "Not really. I just spoke up." "That's more than most people do," Jamal said, his tone serious. "What happened to you could have happened to any of us. But you're out here making sure it doesn't keep happening. That's big, man." Elijah nodded, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "It's not just about me, though. It's about all of us. I don't want anyone else to feel what I felt that night." Jamal bumped his shoulder. "And that's why you're gonna change things." The pushback. Not everyone was supportive of the Carter Initiative. As the movement gained traction, backlash from certain corners of the community grew louder. Anonymous comments on social media accused Marcus and Elijah of overreacting, of playing the race card. Others defended the officers, insisting they were just doing their jobs. At a city council meeting, one particularly vocal opponent, a local business owner named Greg Watson, stood up to speak. "This initiative is a waste of resources," Watson declared. "Our police officers are under enough pressure as it is. If anything, we should be giving them more support, not tying their hands with unnecessary regulations." Elijah, seated in the audience beside his father, felt a surge of anger. He wanted to stand up, to shout back, but Marcus placed a calming hand on his shoulder. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he rose with a calm yet commanding presence. "Mr. Watson," Marcus began, addressing the man directly, "no one is suggesting that law enforcement doesn't face challenges. But accountability and fairness are not hindrances. They're necessities. My son, a 15-year-old boy, was stopped at gunpoint for riding his bike. If you think that's acceptable, then perhaps the problem isn't with this initiative. It's with your perspective." The room erupted in applause, drowning out Watson's sputtering response. Elijah couldn't help but smile, pride swelling in his chest. A growing movement. As weeks turned into months, the Carter Initiative grew into something much larger than Marcus or Elijah had imagined. Neighboring communities began adopting similar measures, inspired by the Carter's efforts. National advocacy groups took notice, offering resources and support. Elijah, once a quiet, carefree kid, had become a confident speaker and a symbol of resilience for his peers. He spoke at rallies, wrote op-eds for the local newspaper, and even appeared on a televised panel about youth activism. One evening, as Marcus and Elijah returned home from another successful meeting, Marcus paused in the driveway, looking up at the house where so many of their plans had been born. "You've grown a lot these past few months," he said, his voice filled with pride. Elijah grinned. "So have you, Dad. I've never seen you fight this hard for something." Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "That's because this fight is worth everything. And so are you." The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as they stood together under the porch light, father and son knew one thing for certain. They were making a difference, and they weren't stopping anytime soon. The breaking point. The Carter Initiative had reached a critical juncture. While it had garnered widespread support in Briarwood and surrounding communities, it faced fierce resistance from entrenched forces within the local police department and certain city officials. The battle over accountability had moved beyond community meetings and into the heart of the legal and political system. Marcus spent his days navigating a complex web of negotiations, legal filings, and media appearances. Elijah, meanwhile, juggled his schoolwork with activism, speaking at youth events, and rallying his peers to take ownership of the movement. But the opposition was relentless. Anonymous threats began arriving in the mail, scrawled in shaky handwriting on plain paper. They were vague but menacing, warning Marcus and Elijah to back off before it was too late. "Cowards," Marcus muttered, tossing one of the notes into a desk drawer already half full of similar messages. Elijah, standing nearby, crossed his arms. "Should we tell someone? Like the police?" Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "We could, but what would that accomplish? These are scare tactics. They want us to feel unsafe, to back down. We won't give them that satisfaction." Despite his father's reassurances, Elijah couldn't shake the weight of the threats. They were a constant reminder that the fight they were waging was far from safe or easy. A call to action. The turning point came one Friday evening, during a public forum hosted by the city council. The meeting was meant to be an open discussion about the Carter Initiative, but tensions in the packed room were palpable. Protesters against the initiative held signs reading, "Support our police," and "Stop blaming officers for doing their job." Supporters of the initiative countered with chants of "Justice for all" and "Bias has no badge." Elijah sat in the front row beside his father, his stomach twisting in knots. Marcus was scheduled to speak, but the room's hostility was unnerving. When Marcus took the podium, the crowd quieted, though the air buzzed with anticipation. "My name is Marcus Carter," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "I stand before you today, not just as a judge, but as a father whose son was held at gunpoint for no reason other than a presumption, a dangerous presumption that has cost too many lives and shattered too many families." Before he could continue, a man in the crowd interrupted, shouting, "You're trying to turn this town against its own police." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the opposing side of the room. Marcus held up a hand, his expression firm but composed. "No," he said, meeting the heckler's gaze. "What I'm trying to do is ensure that no one else has to live in fear of the people sworn to protect them. Accountability is not an attack. It's a necessity." The room erupted into applause, though the heckler and his allies glared in defiance. Marcus continued, laying out the initiative's objectives with clarity and conviction. By the time he stepped down, even some of the skeptics in the room looked thoughtful. The incident. Later that night, as the Carters drove home, the streets were unusually quiet. Elijah stared out the window, replaying the night's events in his mind. "You did good, Dad," he said, breaking the silence. Marcus glanced at him in the rearview mirror and smiled. "We did good. This is a team effort." Their sense of triumph was short-lived. As they turned onto a dark stretch of road near their neighborhood, headlights suddenly appeared behind them, blindingly bright. Marcus frowned, checking his rearview mirror. The car behind them was tailgating aggressively. "Stay calm," Marcus said, his voice steady but tense. The vehicle behind them flashed its high beams, then sped up to pull alongside them. Marcus slowed down, trying to create distance, but the other car swerved, forcing them toward the shoulder. "Dad." Elijah's voice was sharp with alarm. "I see it," Marcus said, gripping the wheel tightly. The car finally sped past them, but not before someone leaned out the passenger window and threw something. A brick. It smashed into their windshield, cracking the glass but not breaking through. Marcus slammed on the brakes, pulling over as the other car disappeared into the night. "Are you okay?" he asked, turning to Elijah. Elijah nodded, though his hands were trembling. Yeah, I'm fine." Marcus exhaled, his jaw clenched. This has gone too far. A new resolve. The incident galvanized Marcus and Elijah in a way nothing else could. The next morning, Marcus contacted the media, recounting the attack in detail. He also filed a formal complaint with the police department, demanding an investigation into the incident. Community outrage swelled. Supporters of the Carter Initiative held rallies condemning the act of intimidation. Even some who had been hesitant about the initiative began to voice their support, appalled by the lengths to which the opposition was willing to go. Elijah, despite his shaken nerves, threw himself into the work with renewed determination. He spoke passionately at a youth-led rally, addressing a crowd of hundreds. "They tried to scare us into silence," he said, his voice steady and strong. "But all they did was prove how much we need this change. Fear won't stop us. Hate won't stop us. We're stronger than that." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. A step forward. In the weeks that followed, the momentum of the Carter Initiative became unstoppable. The city council, under immense public pressure, voted to approve the first phase of the initiative, implementing mandatory bias training for officers and creating a temporary community oversight board. It wasn't everything Marcus and Elijah had hoped for, but it was a start, a foundation upon which they could build. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, Elijah looked at his father and said, "Do you think it'll really change things?" Marcus smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Change is slow, Elijah. It doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward matters. And what you've done, it matters." Elijah nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, he felt truly ready to walk it. The ripple effect. The aftermath of the attack on Marcus and Elijah's car reverberated throughout the community. News of the incident spread quickly, igniting debates on every platform, from social media to local coffee shops. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a flashpoint in the ongoing struggle for justice and accountability. Elijah found himself inundated with messages, some supportive, others hateful. His peers rallied around him, offering solidarity and encouragement, while Marcus received calls from colleagues, legal experts, and even a few wary city officials who wanted to distance themselves from the escalating tension. One morning, Elijah scrolled through his phone, stopping on a message from a boy named Terrell. It read, "I saw what happened to you, man. My little brother got stopped by the police last year, and they scared him so bad he can't even walk to school alone anymore. I wish I had your courage." Elijah stared at the message, his heart heavy with both sorrow and resolve. He showed it to his father. "It's bigger than us, Dad," he said softly. "People need this." Marcus nodded. "They do. And that's why we can't let fear dictate our actions. If we step back now, what does that tell kids like Terrell's brother? That it's okay for this to keep happening." Elijah straightened his shoulders. "Then we keep going. Building bridges." Despite the growing polarization, Marcus believed in the power of dialogue. He reached out to the police department, requesting a meeting with Chief Daniels, a veteran officer known for his pragmatic leadership style. To Marcus's surprise, the chief agreed. When the day of the meeting arrived, Marcus and Elijah entered the police headquarters with measured determination. Chief Daniels greeted them in his office, his expression neutral but attentive. "I'll be honest," Daniels said, gesturing for them to sit. "This whole situation has put us in a tough spot. Morale is low among the officers, and they feel like they're under attack. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Chief, no one is attacking good officers who do their jobs with integrity. But the system has cracks that allow bias to fester and harm to occur. If we don't address those cracks, we're failing both the officers and the community." Daniel sighed. "I've seen the footage from that night. It's concerning. I've already spoken with the officers involved, and there will be consequences. But I need to know, what are you really trying to achieve here?" Elijah, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "We're trying to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. This isn't about punishing the police. It's about making things better for everyone." The chief studied Elijah for a long moment before nodding. "I'll support the first phase of your initiative, but I need your help in making sure the department doesn't feel like the enemy in all this. Can we agree on that?" Marcus extended a hand. "We can agree on that." Unexpected allies. As the Carter Initiative gained momentum, unexpected allies began to emerge. A group of retired police officers reached out, offering their support. They shared stories of witnessing bias during their years on the force and expressed regret for not speaking out sooner. One retired officer, Linda Garcia, became a vocal advocate for the initiative. At a community forum, she shared her perspective. "I spent 25 years on the force, and I can tell you this: good policing starts with trust. If the community doesn't trust us, we can't do our jobs effectively. The Carter Initiative isn't anti-police, it's pro-accountability. And accountability makes us all better." Her words struck a chord, softening the resistance from some members of the community. Elijah's moment. Elijah's role in the movement continued to grow. Invitations to speak poured in, and his confidence blossomed with each appearance. At one event, held at a local high school auditorium, he stood before a crowd of students, teachers, and parents. "Before all this happened," Elijah began, "I didn't think about activism or change. I just wanted to ride my bike, hang out with my friends, and listen to music. But when something unfair happens, something that shakes you to your core, you have a choice. You can stay silent, or you can stand up." He paused, scanning the room. "I chose to stand up, not because it's easy. It's not. But because I know what it feels like to be afraid for no reason. And I don't want anyone else to feel that way." The room erupted in applause, and Elijah felt a swell of pride. For the first time, he truly understood the power of his voice. The vote. The day of the City Council's final vote on the Carter Initiative arrived with a mix of anticipation and tension. Supporters and opponents packed the council chamber, their signs and chants a vivid representation of the divide. Elijah and Marcus sat side by side, their presence a symbol of the movement's heart. The council members debated for hours, with arguments for and against the initiative flying back and forth. When the vote was finally called, the room fell silent. One by one, the council members cast their votes. Yes, yes, no, no, yes, yes, yes. The motion passed. Cheers erupted from the supporters, tears streaming down the faces of many. Elijah turned to his father, his smile wide and triumphant. "We did it," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Marcus pulled him into a hug. "We did, but this is just the beginning. A new chapter." As the Carters left the chamber that night, the air felt different, lighter, filled with hope. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they had taken a monumental step toward change. Elijah glanced at his father as they walked to the car. "What now?" Marcus smiled. "Now we keep building, one step at a time." The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. And as they drove home under the quiet glow of the streetlights, Elijah couldn't help but feel that they were on the brink of something extraordinary. The legacy of courage. The victory of the Carter Initiative was a defining moment for Briarwood, but Marcus and Elijah knew it was only the first step in a much larger journey. Change, they had learned, was not a single event. It was a continuous process, requiring vigilance, dedication, and the courage to face new challenges as they arose. In the weeks following the council's approval, the first measures of the initiative began to take shape. Bias training sessions for law enforcement were scheduled, and the Community Oversight Board, composed of a diverse group of residents, including educators, activists, and even a retired police officer, held its inaugural meeting. Elijah sat in the back row during that first meeting, watching as ordinary citizens took their seats at the long table. They were nervous but determined, their voices unified by a shared goal: to create a safer, fairer Briarwood. As the meeting progressed, Elijah's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from his friend Jamal. "You started all this, man. Look at what you've done." Elijah smiled, typing back quickly. "We did it, Jamal. Together." But even as the seeds of change began to sprout, the backlash hadn't entirely faded. Some in the community continued to resist, criticizing the Oversight Board as unnecessary or labeling the bias training as anti-police. And though the threats against the Carters had ceased, tensions still simmered beneath the surface. Healing the divide. Recognizing the ongoing divide, Marcus and Elijah decided to host a town hall meeting designed to bring the community together. Held in the gymnasium of Briarwood High School, the event aimed to foster dialogue between those who supported the initiative and those who felt alienated by it. The gym was packed that evening, with rows of folding chairs filled to capacity. Police officers, business owners, teachers, students, and parents all gathered under one roof, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Marcus opened the meeting with a simple yet powerful statement. "We're here tonight because we all care about this town. We may have different perspectives, but that doesn't mean we can't work together. Let's focus on what unites us, rather than what divides us." Elijah was the second speaker, standing at the podium. He scanned the crowd, feeling the weight of their gazes. "I used to think change was something that happened far away," he began. "Something other people did. But I've learned that change starts here, with us. It's not about choosing sides. It's about choosing fairness, compassion, and understanding." For the next 2 hours, residents took turns sharing their thoughts, fears, and hopes. Some officers spoke candidly about the challenges they faced in their work, while others expressed their concerns about the initiative. Supporters of the movement shared personal stories of racial profiling and discrimination, shedding light on experiences many in the room hadn't considered. By the end of the night, while not everyone had been swayed, a sense of mutual respect had begun to take root. Elijah's project. As the town hall's success buoyed his spirits, Elijah began envisioning a way to involve more young people in the movement. Inspired by the youth-led subcommittee that had supported the Carter Initiative, he proposed a new program, the Briarwood Youth Justice League. The idea was simple but impactful: a group of young people dedicated to advocating for fairness, educating their peers about social issues, and volunteering in the community. Elijah pitched the idea to his school principal, who enthusiastically agreed to support it. Within weeks, the Youth Justice League had its first meeting, with over 50 students in attendance. Elijah stood at the front of the classroom, outlining their goals. "We're not just here to talk about change," he said. "We're here to create it. Whether it's organizing food drives, hosting workshops, or mentoring younger kids, we're going to make Briarwood a better place." The energy in the room was electric, and Elijah felt a surge of pride as his classmates brainstormed ideas and made plans. The national stage. As the Carter Initiative's success continued to draw attention, Marcus and Elijah found themselves invited to speak at conferences and events across the country. At one such event, a national summit on criminal justice reform, Marcus addressed an audience of policymakers, lawyers, and activists. "My son's courage is what started this journey," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And his courage has reminded me of an essential truth. Justice is not a gift, it's a right. And it's our responsibility to ensure that right is upheld for everyone, no matter who they are." Elijah, who spoke after his father, shared his perspective as a teenager caught in the crosshairs of bias. "I'm not an activist or a politician," he said. "I'm just a kid who loves riding his bike and listening to music. But when something wrong happens, you can't stay quiet. You have to speak up, even when it's scary." Their speeches were met with standing ovations, and the Carters left the summit with a renewed sense of purpose, a brighter future. Back in Briarwood, life began to settle into a new normal. The streets, once marred by mistrust and fear, felt a little safer, a little brighter. The Oversight Board was making progress, reviewing cases and recommending changes to departmental policies. Elijah, now a junior in high school, found a new rhythm in his life. Between school, his role in the Youth Justice League, and occasional speaking engagements, his days were full but fulfilling. One evening, as he and Marcus sat on the porch watching the sunset, Elijah turned to his father. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "All the time. That night could have broken us, Elijah. But instead, it became the start of something bigger." Elijah smiled, the warmth of his father's words settling over him. "I guess we showed them what Carter courage looks like." Marcus chuckled. "That we did, son. That we did." The fight for justice was far from over, but the Carters had proven that even the darkest moments could be the catalyst for change. Together, they had built a legacy of courage, resilience, and hope, a legacy that would inspire generations to come.